and something that I've been thinking about for over a year. But now that these programs and their coaches have a year under their belt, and now we've gone through a spring, we've gone through an off season, we've gone through fall camp, we've gone through some recruiting and some transfer portal cycles as well, it almost seems like the pendulum is leaning one way or another compared to these two programs. Now, Wisconsin and Nebraska both fired their coaches in the middle of the season in 2022. And they hired their current head coaches just 5 days apart, and I and a lot of others applauded both of these hires. Matt Rhule getting hired to be the head coach at Nebraska, and Luke Fickell being hired the head coach at Wisconsin. Now, both of these programs, both of these teams are going to be compared so much because of the nature of how these coaching changes happened and when they happened and how similar they were. But now that we've gotten to where we've gotten, and the vibes around the Nebraska program following that big win over Colorado seem to be very, very high. The feeling of where this Nebraska team is and where they could be is a lot different from the feeling surrounding the Wisconsin Badgers and where they are and where they could be, which is very interesting because I think when both of these coaches took over, you could argue, and I think it's a very winnable argument, should I say, that Wisconsin was in a better spot with Paul Chryst and where he left them than where Scott Frost left Nebraska. You know, Wisconsin needed modernizing their offense. Their whole program needed just a facelift. They needed to kind of get up with the times, kind of get up with speed. It was ever apparent that if Wisconsin stuck with Paul Chryst, they were going to keep on falling behind and falling behind and falling behind. Now, Nebraska, I thought, like, Scott Frost recruited top 25 classes. There was talent there. It's just Scott Frost couldn't keep them there, and Scott Frost couldn't develop this talent. Both Luke Fickell and both Matt Rhule are very good builders and are very good developers of programs. Now, when you take a look at where both of these programs and both of these coaches are, I think when it comes to these assistant coaching hires, Nebraska has won it just based on Tony White. One coordinator, I think, has given the victory to the Nebraska Cornhuskers right now. Because what Tony White has been able, what he did with that defense last year, and then what he's been able to do with that defense this year, right, on offense and on defense, Nebraska's defense is the best out of these four units. And it might not be particularly close. Right, he has taken this defense and built them up into one of the Big Ten's best units. And there are players that were recruited by Scott Frost, that played under Eric Shenander, right, that were in that era. And now Tony White comes in, he puts them in the right spot pre-snap, and he puts them into advantageous situations, and look what happens. And look what happens. Here you are. Now, there's one word that I want to touch on. Identity. Identity. And I think that's really the core talking point when you talk about where Wisconsin is, and then when you talk about where the Wisconsin Badgers are. When you looked at Wisconsin for 30 years, Barry Alvarez, Brett Bielema, we'll forget about Gary Anderson, and Paul Chryst, what did you know? What was the identity of Wisconsin football? It was NFL offensive linemen up front, big guys. They could churn out those types of talents year in and year out, and it was RBU. You know you were always going to have a great running back at Wisconsin, and then you had a really good defense to lean on. It was great and elite in that 3-4 scheme with Jim Leonard as well. Now, what's the identity of Nebraska now? Nebraska is a team that is built upon one of the best defenses in the Big Ten, a top 10 to top 15 defense in college football. They are built on physicality, great line play. They want to run the football right at you. Sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? It's not a complete copy and paste, but it's very similar to the type of mindset that Wisconsin had for all of those years. Now, here's another question. What's the identity of Wisconsin football? What's the identity? when you look back at Luke Fickell's teams at Cincinnati, right, those were really good defensive football teams. And I think this defense is still lacking some sort of identity. You know, I think the whole thing with Wisconsin is that this is more of a long-term build than it is for Matt Rhule over at Nebraska, because they've switched from that scheme under Jim Leonard, and now they've gone to a 3-3-5 type of scheme. And, man, you look at that defensive line for Wisconsin. It's got some work to do. It's got some work to do. You know, losing James Thompson Jr., it doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help anybody. But when you look at, we talked about at the top of the segment, the vibes of these two programs are very different based on what's happened really the first 2 weeks, where Nebraska has looked impressive. They looked impressive against UTEP, a G5 team, in which they should have looked impressive. And then they looked really good, of course, against Colorado. But you compare it on the other side to the Wisconsin Badgers. A 4-quarter game against Western Michigan and a 4-quarter game against South Dakota. And I think at bits and pieces during some of those games, maybe more than others for some of these teams, that Western Michigan and South Dakota were able to control the line of scrimmage, or at least draw even to maybe with what Wisconsin was trying to do if you factor in the entire 60-minute game as well, which is not going to happen to a team like Nebraska. It wouldn't have happened to a team in the past like the Wisconsin Badgers. Now, okay, maybe we're forming a new identity. Maybe your identity is the dairy raid. Maybe our identity is what Phil Longo brings to the offensive side of the football. Now, last year, I think we learned just how drastic of a change it was going to be from Wisconsin lining up 2 tight ends, 12 personnel, running the football, establishing the toughness and physicality at the line of scrimmage to this type of offense. Now you fast forward to this year, I think it looks better. But once again, this seems more because of the drastic changes on the offensive schemes and the defensive schemes. This seems more of a long-term build at Wisconsin than maybe what they're doing in this short-term flip right now at Wisconsin. But offensively, what's Wisconsin's identity? Okay, because there's been times where they kind of look like the Wisconsin of old. There were times that, you know, during those first couple of drives against Western Michigan where one drive, I think, went 16 plays down the field, and they are just churning the ball. You've got Tawee Walker, you know, you've got Ches Malusi. You saw Cade Yakimelli, right, get involved against South Dakota and gain some momentum in the run game as well. But then you see other times where they try to spread it out and they try to throw the football and gain some momentum that way. I think Wisconsin is still trying to formulate who they are. And the identity piece, I think, is why Nebraska is ahead of the game right now and why they feel that they are in a better situation than the Wisconsin Badgers right now. Now, this is certainly not an all is lost for Wisconsin, but I just think this thing in Madison is maybe going to take a little bit longer to get to that 8-win level, to get to that 9-win level than anticipated. And I think a big part of them getting to that level quicker, sooner rather than later, is making this Phil Longo thing work. Now, I think the jury's still out. I think I'm putting it kindly that way. I think the jury's still out on if Phil Longo and this scheme is going to work. I know a lot of people, other people have maybe more harsher opinions than that when it comes to Phil Longo. But if this thing doesn't work, and if they can't get in a rhythm this year, maybe they go 6-6 or whatever, and they have to make a move and bring in a new offensive scheme, now you're kind of starting back at square one. And now the first 2 years of completely flipping this scheme, now you're just going back to something else. And now you're back behind the 8 ball once again offensively. So, as of right now, I'd say yes. Nebraska is in a better situation for now and for the future, although both teams are recruiting very well. But the difference may be Nebraska's got a 5-star quarterback and Wisconsin does not.
Thanks for watching Big Ten TED, where it's all Big Ten all year long. Make sure to like the video to spread the word of Big Ten Ted to the masses, and subscribe to the channel for updates on Big Ten content that drops every day.